Hi guys, it's Kirsty. Today's video is about magical thinking. But before I go into that, I'd like to ask, please do subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below in order to stay up to date with new videos as they're released. So the reason I wanted to do this video is because magical thinking is a bit of a trap that we can find ourselves getting into when we suffer from anxiety and OCD, and it can add fuel to the fire when it comes to the fear cycle that keeps these conditions locked on for us. So magical thinking, like black and white thinking and like awfulizing or catastrophizing, is another cognitive distortion. So a cognitive distortion is an unhelpful way of thinking that can lead to us to experiencing difficulties in terms of our emotions that we might be feeling. So they can add fuel to the fire with mental health conditions such as OCD, anxiety or depression. So essentially they're like thought patterns that cause people to view reality in an inaccurate and usually negative or dangerous way. So somebody who is experiencing kind of magical thinking might believe that by doing certain things, they can prevent other things that are completely unrelated from happening. So, for example, somebody might think that if they knock 3 times on a piece of wood, they can stop anything bad happening to their parents, for example. Or perhaps with, for example, superstitions are kind of magical thinking, really. Or don't step on a crack because it will break your mother's back. Or it might be, I talk about this thing that might happen. Hopefully it won't. Touch wood or touch wood on a piece of wood. So various things like that. So it's basically doing something or saying something or maybe even thinking something in a way to that will make something else less likely to happen, even though the event that we want to prevent happening is absolutely completely unrelated to the action that we're doing. Whether that's something bad happening to somebody, that has nothing to do with whether I knock 3 times on a piece of wood or whether I repeat something in my mind or stepping on pavement cracks has nothing to do with whether or not my mum's back gets broken. So, these are just some examples, but somebody who suffers from anxiety or OCD might take this kind of thinking more seriously, and it feels more sinister because our alarm bells are kind of going off more. So, a lot of people would think sort of magical thinking, and that's why superstition is such a big thing. Sports stars will wear the same socks for every game, for example, because they happen to have had wins whenever they've worn those socks. Now, that's actually, there's no link between the two. Technically, there's no scientific evidence to suggest that wearing a certain pair of socks might perform somebody's, what might make somebody more likely to win a sports game. If perhaps, unless of course they were, they exchanged these particular pair of socks for a really crap pair of socks that were really uncomfortable. But if a sports star, for example, felt like they had to have their hair done in a certain way, and then they're more likely to win a game, one has nothing to do with the other, but they are somehow making a link between the two, and they feel like they have some kind of a small amount of control over and above their performance that will affect the end result of the game. So people can take, use magical thinking or think in these kinds of ways, whether or not they have OCD and anxiety. But it can actually become quite unhelpful for people who do suffer from OCD or anxiety if they think in this way, because it might give them a false sense of control that they can prevent something bad from happening, for example, or make good things happen by doing something just because, previously something bad hasn't happened when they've knocked 3 times on a piece of wood, for example. That doesn't mean that stops something bad from happening. So, that person may then start to get stuck on the idea that if they don't do this thing, then that bad thing will happen or is more likely to happen, when in fact one thing has absolutely nothing to do with the other thing. So if we think about it in terms of rational emotive behavioural therapy, where Albert Ellis encourages people, if they want to reduce emotional disturbance, to think more scientifically, i.e., is there any evidence to support the beliefs that we might hold? Scientific thinking is essentially the antithesis to magical thinking, actually, because if you break down the magical thinking, what evidence is there what factual evidence is there scientifically to suggest that you're knocking on a bit of wood or whatever it might be has anything to do with something bad not happening to somebody? It's just luck that something bad hasn't happened to them on that particular day. So in terms of compulsions, if we're talking OCD with magical thinking, it might be like outward compulsions, such as knocking a certain amount of times on something, or it might be having to, if you say a certain word, it might be then having to say another word afterwards, or it might be having to turn the light switch on and off a certain amount of times, or something like that. But there also might be mental compulsions that people do as well. So it might be avoiding thinking about certain things, thinking if I think about something, then it might happen. So again, there's what has your thoughts got to do with, something else happening? But with that particular thing, though, interestingly enough, somebody who doesn't suffer from OCD might want to not think about, I can't, I don't even want to think about that. They don't even want to think about certain things because it makes them feel uncomfortable thinking, feeling the certain feelings if that negative event did happen. So again, this is something, it's not just OCD sufferers would do to not think about certain things, but the difference is it's that we can get locked onto the idea that somehow by thinking something, it's more likely to happen. Which is, that's essentially suggesting that we have the power to make something happen or not happen simply by thinking it, which makes us magicians, which unfortunately we are not. Otherwise, we'd be able to magic, maybe we'd be able to magic OCD away. But so there's other mental rituals that people may do. People may repeat things in their minds after they've seen or heard something, hoping that they'll prevent something from happening. Or they might feel that by if they've had this thought, they might then have to say something else in their mind to stop that thing from happening. So almost in a way to mentally decontaminate themselves and prevent this external event from happening. Essentially, magical thinking it might give an OCD or anxiety sufferer a false sense of control over things that might happen. They incorrectly feel that they can control something and prevent it from happening, when in fact they can't prevent that thing from happening. They can only do so much, and it's certainly not going to prevent this unwanted event from happening by doing something completely unrelated. So in order to start getting past this idea of if I don't do this unwanted thing might happen, again, it's looking at what the feared scenario actually may be. So if the feared scenario is something horrible happening to somebody that you love, and so you have to do this thing, in order for you to be able to bring down the anxiety and, the absolute horror surrounding these thoughts, and to help you not feel like you need to do this thing, we need to bring our fear down of the worst case scenario. So once again, it's looking at disputing that it would be awful if said event happened. I've done a video recently actually about disputing our irrational beliefs. So this would be disputing it again. So firstly, we would look at, what scientific evidence do I have that this particular thing that I'm doing actually has any control over something else from happening, aside from it's just, coincidence that so far that thing hasn't happened. But then also bringing our fear down of the thing that we're afraid of happening in order to help us reduce the compulsions that we're doing. So we don't feel like we need to control the situation quite as to such a high extent. Now, this doesn't mean that we would necessarily say we want this event to happen, or that we don't care if this event happens, or that we would only be mildly upset if this event happens. We could still say, we'd be terribly upset if this thing happened, but the whole world wouldn't fall apart and it wouldn't be the whole awful thing that we think it is. So once we can truly get behind that new belief that it's not as awful as we thought, it brings the fear down, and then we won't feel quite as much of a compulsive urge to do these rituals that we have been doing in order to prevent this thing from happening. So for the non-anxiety or OCD sufferer, magical thinking can offer an extra sense of comfort in certain situations. Unfortunately, for the anxiety or OCD sufferer, it just adds to the continuous feelings of discomfort, because it gives us this false sense of control that we in fact don't have, and makes us feel the need to do the compulsions, which of course fuel the fear cycle and bring on the obsessions more. So I hope this video has been helpful in terms of recognizing when magical thinking might be at play, if we're making links between things that have nothing to do with each other, and recognizing some of the compulsions that we might be doing, and recognize the false sense of control we might have, when in fact this false sense of control is actually leading us to feel more out of control as we get more stuck onto our OCD obsession, or if we get more kind of latched onto our anxiety fear cycles that are going on. And I hope the video has been helpful also in terms of approaching magical thinking, in that it is a case of identifying what the fear is, what the thing that we're trying to prevent happening is, and starting to break this down and look at this in a more rational way. So thanks ever so much for watching this video, and take care. Bye.